Banking in the period immediately prior to passage of the Federal Reserve Act was subject to a myriad of controls, regulations, subsidies, and privileges at both the federal and state levels. Popular history portrays this period as one of unbridled competition and free banking. It was, in fact, a halfway house to central banking. Wall Street, however, wanted more government participation. The New York bankers particularly wanted a lender of last resort to create unlimited amounts of fiat money for their use in the event they were exposed to bank runs or currency drains. They also wanted to force all banks to follow the same inadequate reserve policies so that more cautious ones would not draw down the reserves of the others. An additional objective was to limit the growth of new banks in the South and West. This was a time of growing enchantment with the idea of trusts and cartels. For those who had already made it to the top, competition was considered chaotic and wasteful. Wall Street was snowballing into two major banking groups, the Morgans and the Rockefellers, and even they had largely ceased competing with each other in favor of cooperative financial structures. But to keep these cartel combines from flying apart, a means of discipline was needed to force the participants to abide by the agreements. The federal government was brought in as a partner to serve that function. To sell the plan to Congress, the cartel reality had to be hidden. The name central bank had to be avoided. The word federal was chosen to make it sound like it was a government operation. The word reserve was chosen to make it appear financially sound. And the word system, the first drafts used the word association, was chosen to conceal the fact that it was a central bank. A structure of 12 regional institutions was conceived as a further ploy to create the illusion of decentralization. But the mechanism was designed from the beginning to operate as a central bank, closely modeled after the Bank of England. In Chapter 13 of his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, Edward Griffin tells how the Aldrich Bill became the Vreeland Bill, which in turn evolved into the Federal Reserve Act. Join me now as we continue our exploration of this very important topic. Before proceeding further, please click on the like button and subscribe to my channel. These steps will help ensure continued delivery of these videos to you. Senator Nelson Aldrich had been an early advocate of central banking. As chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, he had pushed through the creation of the National Monetary Commission. This group had laid the foundation for what would become the Federal Reserve System. However, by 1906, it was obvious that the Commission's report lacked sufficient political support for establishing central banking. Aldrich decided to try another tack. He would introduce a central banking bill and attempt to get it passed in the Senate. The trouble was, he selected the wrong bill. The one he chose was too obviously a central banking measure and encountered strong opposition. In less than 3 weeks, the entire issue had turned into a political football. It was clear that the Senate was not going to accept Aldrich's blatant proposal. The senator was politically astute enough to realize when the jig was up. On March 1, 1907, he announced to the Senate that he intended to withdraw his measure and let it die. Later, he explained why. "I want to take a rest from banking." But the show was not over. Bankers gathered again on Jekyll Island in November of that year for a secret meeting that would result in drafting a new set of proposals. Those present included Paul Vorburg, Frank Vanderlip, and Benjamin Strong, the same men who had drafted the Aldrich Bill. They prepared a document entitled The Draft of a Plan for a Central Banking System, which is what we have come to call the Federal Reserve Act. The scheme was still central banking, but it was packaged as something else. Vorburg saw to that. He understood that the term central bank carried with it such negative connotations that it would never pass muster in Washington. So he made sure to avoid that term. According to historian Griffin, in the entire text of the plan, there was no mention of the words central and banked. Instead, he used terms such as Federal Reserve Association, Reserve Agent, Reserve Bank, Federal Clearinghouse. When the time came to introduce the plan to Congress, the bankers knew they needed a congressional sponsor who could give it credibility. That man was Congressman Charles A. Vreeland of New York. The choice of Vreeland was brilliant. As Griffin points out, he was not only regarded as being honest and fair-minded, but also as being definitely anti-Wall Street. As it turned out, that was just what the bankers wanted. Vreeland, who was not opposed to central banking in principle, was happy to oblige. With the new proposals in hand, he introduced them to the House on February 3, 1908, under the title, "A Bill to Provide for the Better Regulation of Interstate and Foreign Exchange and for the Improvement of the Banking and Currency System of the United States." And that long title proved to be prophetic. The new plan consisted of two bills. One addressed the currency issue, the other, the banking problem. Both were enacted into law on December 23, 1908. Unfortunately, the combined bills were far from perfect. Many antitrust lawyers and legal scholars would later point out that the establishment of the Federal Reserve System constituted a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. But the plan had many ardent supporters in Congress, including President Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, it was Teddy who suggested the name Federal Reserve, and it was an inspired choice. At least the name stuck. With the plan now on the president's desk, the bankers knew they had won a great victory. Now the rest of the country would soon be joining the club. The conspiracy theorists among us might stop right here, convinced that we have found the smoking gun proving that the Federal Reserve was planned in secret by bankers and foisted upon the American people by a cabal of conspirators. There is some truth to this view, of course, but if we are to understand how it happened that a small group of private bankers have come to exercise such profound control over our economy, we must look beyond the simple story of Jekyll Island. True, the meeting at Jekyll Island was an important event. True, the plan that emerged from that meeting has resulted in the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. True, the bankers who were involved in creating the Fed and the stock market crash of 1929 owned the mainstream media lock, stock, and barrel. But we must understand that the story of the Fed is larger than any conspiracy theory can explain. By 1906, the U.S. had been experiencing significant economic growth. And with growth comes problems. Banks failed. Factories shut down. People lost their jobs. There were riots in the streets. Sound familiar? Well, yes, but it was happening then just as it does now, long before the Fed was created. The difference was that back then, unlike now, there was no central bank to bail everyone out, and this worried the bankers. They had gotten used to making money in good times and losing money in bad times, and they wanted to put an end to that. In fact, it was that simple. They just wanted a lender of last resort who would come to the rescue whenever a bank got into trouble. And if necessary, they wanted someone who could create money out of thin air to deal with emergencies. The Fed is still not allowed to do this, by the way, but it did it anyway during the savings and loan crisis, the long-term capital management bankruptcy, and the most recent financial meltdown. Until 1906, the U.S. had operated under the gold standard. Under this system, every dollar in circulation had to be backed by a corresponding amount of gold held in trust by the issuing bank. A run on the bank would reduce the amount of gold reserves. If the bank were forced to abandon the gold standard to meet its obligations, it would be unable to exchange dollars for gold at the old rate. This would result in the bank's insolvency, and that meant the end of the bank. With no lender of last resort, depositors would have to line up outside the bank to get their money back. If there were not enough funds available, they would receive only a portion of their deposits, and any excess value would be lost forever. Once the Fed was created, this was no longer a worry. In fact, it was the reverse. Because the Fed could create money out of nothing. If a bank run occurred, the Fed would simply print enough money to cover the shortfall. This gave depositors confidence that their money would always be available. And this confidence, or at least this perceived confidence, prevented bank runs. In effect, the Fed guarantees the solvency of any bank it chooses to guarantee. It does this by lending money to the bank at a low interest rate. Because the Fed is effectively creating money out of nothing, this means the bank has an endless supply of funds to lend out at higher rates of interest. This is what makes the Fed a lender of last resort. The beauty of the Fed, from the banker's point of view, is that it creates a moral hazard. Moral hazard exists when one party takes risks, knowing that another party will be responsible for the consequences of those risks. The Fed removes the risk of bank failure. This allows banks to take big chances with depositors' money. Without the Fed, banks would be incentivized to be more prudent in their lending practices. The Fed encourages reckless behavior. Any bank failure would be a loss of face for the Fed. How would the U.S. government recover from that? By bailing out the bank, of course. And guess who pays for that? We do. But wait, you say, the Fed is supposed to be a government institution. How can it print money out of nothing? Well, it can. And it does. The Fed creates money when it buys government bonds from commercial banks. By purchasing these bonds, the Fed injects cash into the banking system. This cash is then lent out until it eventually finds its way back to the Fed in the form of deposits. The process is then repeated over and over again. Since the Fed is a government agency, it does not have to follow the same reserve requirements as commercial banks. It can simply create money out of nothing and lend it to commercial banks at low interest rates. The banks can then lend this money at higher interest rates and make money for themselves. Or they can deposit it in the Fed and earn interest on it. Either way, the Fed is making money out of nothing and giving it to the banks. It may not surprise you to learn that the Founding Fathers opposed the creation of a central bank. In fact, they hated the very idea. Jefferson famously said, "If the people only understood the rank and justice of our money and credit system, there would be a revolution by morning." And that is why we have been studying this stuff for the past several months. We need to understand how the Fed works. We need to know how our money is created. We need to see how we are taxed without representation. And once we know all of this, we should ask ourselves why this is allowed to continue. Why is the Fed not abolished? Why is our money not returned to gold? Why are we taxed to pay off the national debt? Answers to these questions are not easy to find. But one thing is certain, the path ahead will not be easy. Thanks for watching. Please click on the like button and subscribe to my channel.